Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. So I was inclined to do counter-programming today because when everybody's talking about X, I like to sort of follow the Dispatch motto of hit where they ain't and talk about why. But we've also noticed, for reasons that are kind of hard to fathom, that there's more interest in politics these days than normal. And we've been getting some wild traffic here at the Dispatch in terms of our listeners and our, downloads or whatever. And we figured we should probably lean into that. The problem was I tried to get Starwalt. He's got something with his son. I tried to get a whole bunch of really world-class pundit types to talk to, particularly on the heels of talking to AB. And I couldn't find anybody really, really good. So we had to sort of scrape the bottom of the barrel. And
you don't even need to say my name at this point. They could fill in the blank. They know who's coming now.
So we got Steve Hayes, my partner in crime here at the Dispatch. He's the editor, co-founder. Rumor has it he's working on a piece about something. And welcome back to the Remnant.
Good to be back. Glad to be it's like a bye-week fill-in. If you play fantasy football, you go with somebody really scrubby from a team, and all you hope is you're going to get a couple points. That's what I am. I'm your bye-week fill-in. Or if you're doing TV, it's the holiday weekends when all of the regular TV hosts and guests are off, and then you come in, and happy to be that for you.
Yeah, I often like watching just turning on cable for a second, like on Christmas morning or New Year's Day morning, really early, and just see not so much who's hosting, because I kind of get that's your job.
Yeah.
You agree, you trade these things way in advance, but which really junior reporter is I finally got my break, I'm going to be on TV. And which was where we were 25 years ago. It's oh my gosh, I'm going to be on TV. But it's pretty funny to see you see 22-year-olds just super over prepared and super jazzed to be on, because everybody else is out of town that day,
or the weathered old GOP strategist, who's on to talk about something super serious at 7 a.m. on Christmas morning.
Whose only client left is Burkina Faso, and he's finally
And the thing is, we're having this conversation, and we're both picturing people.
Exactly.
There are definitely people, but we don't need to.
Yeah, I don't want to do that to
unfair
those people. All right. So, one last thing. I think I've told you this before, but lest you think that I'm bound to stay at the Dispatch no matter what. I don't really use LinkedIn a lot. I should use it more. But when we always have to do these interviews for job applicants and all that kind of stuff, that's how you read someone's resume now, is you go to LinkedIn, right? So I have to have an account. And I'm signed up for job notifications. And because of this podcast, part of my description is I'm a host. And so once a week, at least, I get notifications that there are at least 30 new job openings at Cracker Barrel. I just got one this morning. And I was
how much do they pay?
I know. I got options, dude.
Well, that's good. I should just make a note to all Remnant listeners who we know are very loyal Jonah fans. Hit him up to connect with him on LinkedIn, please. Send him lots and lots of LinkedIn requests, because he'll probably take the requests, start long conversations. He loves that.
Yeah, totally. All right. So where to begin? I'll put a thesis forward for you, and you can respond. One of the reasons I actually did think about wanted to have you on here is I'm in a weird Dispatch booster mood, and we're not doing our October thing, State of the Dispatch. That's not this conversation, but I'm in this weird Dispatch booster mood. I'm not usually the big cheerleader around here, and because I think we're in one of these weird moments that was sort of made for us, insofar as everybody, including a lot of media outlets that we like and we're friends with and all that kind of stuff, but everybody is looking to find the narrative the explanatory narrative of this moment of what's going on, and some of it is a little hyperbolic, some of it is, I think too pat or too cute, and we've never really put it this way, but like one of the things we kind of pride ourselves on, without being jerks about it, is narrative disruptors. Like the whole hit where they ain't follow the facts even when they go against the conventional wisdom or one side or the other side's partisan sort of spin. And we've been doing that a lot lately. And so I'm in this mood where like, I think just like everybody is kind of wrong. I think JD Vance is really overrated. And there's a lot of needless hype. I think the bubble's bursting on him much faster than I predicted for the Chris Wallace show 3 days ago. And I think Kamala Harris is wildly overrated. And we're seeing a lot of people who used to say, who like until a week ago, were saying she's a hugely problematic candidate. Now saying, obviously, she's the best possible candidate. We see, on the one hand, a bunch of people for the last X number of months, years, whatever, saying that Joe Biden is perfectly fine and healthy, and it's outrageous to suggest otherwise. And then we have other people on the right who are saying, not only is he not perfectly fine and healthy, but it has been a pernicious conspiracy of the highest order to hide the fact that he's in fact an invalid. And maybe if you go all the way out to the Brett Weinstein crowd, that he's in fact dead and he's being, and we have an AI president. And then you have all the conspiracy theories around the Trump assassination attempt. You had all these people who believed that he had been changed and that he was a different man now and he was humbled and all that. And it just, again and again and again, we're just seeing everywhere eruptions of wish casting and doom mongering and all that kind of stuff. And so how do you actually see the moment?
That's it. I mean, it's an interesting frame. When we started this, you always talked about, you did this in our meetings with prospective investors and in the manifesto, talked about zig when others are zagging. And, that's what we were doing. It was an accurate description of what we were doing, but I was always hoping that people didn't read that as like being contrarian for the sake of being contrarian.
Yeah, no,
which
me
I find
too.
annoying.
I do too.
Like it's just being a contrarian. It's a trick and it's a gimmick, and that doesn't really get you much. But for all of the reasons that you just laid out in detail, I think what we're doing to some extent is different than what most other people are doing in this moment. Both, again, I mean, in roughly the same ways that I think was true when we came up with the idea, which is to say, on the right, you're seeing a lot of conspiracy theorizing. I mean, that's sort of where people go. It's not Joe Biden had COVID, so he stayed out of. I think there were real legitimate questions. I think Joe Biden would have been wise to come out and talk about, address the change in his stepping down in a physical way before he gives a speech from the Oval. But immediately it goes from Joe Biden quits to Joe Biden is maybe dead. Or, they're not telling us there's something more there. And we've seen that. I mean, there are unbelievable and serious, valid questions about the security around the assassination attempt. Just sort of staggering security failure in my mind. But again, it didn't take an hour for once semi-credible people to suggest that this was done on purpose. This was the FBI or the Secret Service either allowing this to happen or authorizing this, or in fact taking part in this. And you go to the coverage of Kamala Harris and this sort of tire screeching that we've seen from the media. And I think it's often lazy to talk about the media because it's not a monolith. I mean, there are nuances and differences that are worth getting into, but it's impossible not to see the celebratory environment that the mainstream media has created to cover Kamala Harris, which includes a ton of insane revisionism favorable pieces on the front page of the New York Times and analyses in the news pages of the paper that we would have never seen about anybody else. So what I think we're doing, or at least what I hope we're doing, because we make a point of doing it, is to say, like, you know what? No, let's take this slower. Let's actually tell people what we're seeing. Let's not put on cheerleading outfits for either side. And when we think this sort of conventional wisdom narrative or the right wing narrative is heading in the wrong direction, pause and sort of poke in that area for a little bit. And I do think, I agree with you that, and this is certainly not just my view, that this is sort of a dispatch moment. We're kind of built for this moment precisely because we're slowing things down a little bit and saying, hey, this is worth reflecting on, and let's actually go back and do a lot of research to make the arguments that we're making, or a ton of reporting to make the arguments that we're making, and not get carried away by the sort of things that we're seeing in the news every day.
So there's some stuff I really want to get to, but let's just do the level set. Where do you see the race now? If you had to, I think I'll stipulate for you, it is crazy to make predictions right now. The polls are going to be totally unreliable. I believe the bump is real for Harris. That makes sense. But we've had an assassination attempt, a GOP convention, and we've replaced the incumbent on the Democratic ticket in the last 10 days. The idea that is settled out enough in America to make polling reliable strikes me as absurd, right? So who knows? But that said, who's going to win?
we don't do this irresponsible predicting stuff. I agree with you entirely. I think the race is really unsettled. Obviously Kamala Harris has had a few good days in ways that are measurable, that go beyond the kind of revisionist reporting that we're seeing from mainstream outlets.
She's taking a huge amount of money.
The amount of money is insane. I think we are now at or over $100 million in not even 72 hours. And there are numbers out this morning. I think it was 38,000 and change young voters who have newly registered to vote. And I think we're likely to continue to see things like that. And some of that, may be the appeal of Kamala Harris, to give her due. She's a sort of standard, or I would say left wing progressive that probably excites some of the people who are signing up for her kind of politics. I think a lot of it, and a lot of what we're bound to see, this is true both in the media coverage, but also in those measurable points of enthusiasm, is that she's not Joe Biden. She can actually finish a sentence. She can make an argument about Trump in a way that he really couldn't for a long time. And I think she's, there are analyses of her time in the Senate that find her to be on the far left of the Democratic Party. One of them, I think it was GovTrack, has her as the most liberal senator during her tenure. And that includes Bernie Sanders, the avowed socialist. So she is on the far left. But I think when you hear her speak, and she's got these idiosyncrasies, she's got things people don't like, she's got these weird turns of phrases where she kind of wanders off, and it's bizarre. And the laugh that people that point to that are strange, but she's a lot more like a normal politician than most politicians we've seen lately. Yeah, which I also thought was potentially something that might help J.D. Vance. He just sort of talks. In his speech, he just sort of talks. And I think that we're likely to see people drawn to that. Now, she won't feel like that for very long because Republicans are working hard to redefine her. And I think they'll have some success based on the things she said and done in the past. But I guess to answer your question directly, after not answering it directly for 2 minutes, the Democrats could have come up with a ticket that I think would have had I don't want to say an easy time, because, these straight line projections are are foolish, but a much easier time defeating Donald Trump. In my mind, they chose, in replacing Joe Biden, almost certainly the most difficult path, or one of the most difficult paths, in that they chose somebody who's closely associated with the Biden administration's policies, who defended Joe Biden from claims going back 3 years that he was having cognitive deterioration, who campaigned as a far, far left progressive when she ran in 2019 and 2020, or I guess she never got to 2020, and is ripe for the kind of caricatures that I think we're likely to see from Republicans. So had they chosen a more moderate ticket with a better spokesman out front, I think Democrats could have had the opportunity to have a realigning election in their favor. And I now think this is much more likely to be a competitive election.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I certainly think that if they could have pulled off, I mean, we've been talking about this in podcasts and offline for so long now that it's hard for me to remember when we weren't talking about this, but like, if there was no penalty, right? If there was no cost to it, going with a Whitmer Warnock or a Shapiro, Kelly ticket, or any of those kinds of things, right? Or Shapiro Moore, would be interesting. But those would all do much better than Harris, right? And what I guess I underestimated was the degree to which the party would have a rush to unity the second they got Biden out of the way, and asking them to then also do it to Harris when she was not willing to have it done to her is trying to leap the canyon in 2 jumps. And like, it just like the rush to sort of say Biden was great and Harris is great, and we just want Harris because, she can campaign and blah, 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 blah. I'm not sure it was possible to get the party. I mean, this is this debate we're having, right? Like Sarah is hitting me up the other night about whether or not this disproves my parties are weak, or the party decides stuff and all that kind of thing. And I would say, yeah, it's evidence that the parties can still decide, but look how hobbled they are that they couldn't actually get the best candidate, or even have an open process. They had to go with Harris because there was just no way around doing that. And they had to, and this is the point I think that's most important. People are saying that the elites forced this, the party bosses forced this. Voters forced this on the party bosses. They've been telling pollsters for 2 years, don't run this guy, get rid of this guy. And it was only when they could no longer deny what everyone else had seen for years that they caved to it. So this idea that somehow this was a coup, which is like the Republican argument now, it's weird. It's like before they pushed Biden out of the way, Democrats said you can't do this because it would be a coup, right? You can't negate the 14 million votes in the primaries for Biden. And then the second they do it, Republicans start saying you can't do this. It was a coup. It's like, and it's not a coup. It's the way parties are supposed to work. But I just don't know. I don't know that it was ever going to be possible to do it any other way than to have Harris in there. I thought it was. I still think there's an argument for it on the merits to do somebody else. But
so why do you think? I mean, I'm very interested in your thoughts on sort of strength of parties in the aftermath of this. I mean, why do you think? What's the main reason in your mind? Or I know you don't like monocausal explanations. What are the main reasons that they were not able to do this? Because just to take it a step back and sort of look at it with a broader perspective, if you believe, and you made this point, I think you made this point in one of your recent newsletters, if you believe that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, an existential threat, fill in the blank. If you think he's really, really, really bad, and I think we can stipulate that most Democrats do, wouldn't you do everything you possibly could, given this opportunity, to take the steps to end that threat, right? Put forward the best possible ticket so that you could extinguish this thing that you have said is a threat all along. They didn't do that. And I think most Democrats, I mean, I've talked to a lot of Democrats about this. They're sort of, not on the record, but But on background, or when you're not quoting them, they're pretty open about it. They will say, she's not great. She's not our best. She has very few fans among her former colleagues in the Senate. There's been this kind of rush to endorse her, and people are all saying nice things about her because I think they're in part so relieved that Joe Biden isn't the candidate anymore, and they don't have to make arguments that are so obviously at odds with reality, with observable reality. But the enthusiasm that we're seeing for Kamala now, I think, is likely to I mean, maybe it continues through the election because she's opposing Donald Trump, but she's not well liked, and people don't think she's particularly good at this. She never made it to Democratic primary voting in 2020. So why do you think that they didn't do this?
I think like Kevin Williams has been making this point for a while now, that she could literally have anything in the world she wants if she just agreed not to be president or run for president. But the fact that she didn't want to move out of the way made it almost impossible to move her out of the way. I think the identity politics stuff is very, very strong. She was Biden's pick to replace him should something befall him, right? So like, I think part of the price of getting him out of the way, even if he doesn't like Kamala very much, he understands for his legacy purposes that he can't be the one to throw her under the bus, or at least he thinks that's the case. So he has to support Harris. And so then the idea of like so repudiating Biden that you also repudiate his chosen successor, who's also a Black woman, I just think it was asking too much of people who found this painful, right? It's like asking two favors of somebody. It's like, Steve, will you help me move? I know it's going to be record-breaking hot. I have a huge bed frame that, it can't get out through the hallways, so we're going to have to break it apart and then carry it separately and blah, 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 blah. And oh, by the way, can you also loan me $5,000? It's just sort of like you get one favor kind of thing. And this was, break two different pieces of glass in case of emergency. And if Harris was going to fight it, that meant they were all doomed, right? So she had this poison pill power that nobody had the energy to fight against. And I think there are a lot of people who just simply, and then you have the fact that all of the potential contenders didn't want to seize the moment, right? You need someone viable to do it. You can't just be, we're going to declare, or we're going to have tryouts if nobody's signaling that they're going to try out. And the second Biden, I would love a good TikTok on why it took 30 minutes for Biden to endorse Harris. But once he did that, everyone was so relieved and so happy that Biden had done it. They were like, okay, so he's basically saying the price of this is support Harris. And then Harris started working the phones and worked them apparently pretty smartly and turned the story not into who's she going to run against, but who's going to run for her vice president. I just think it was sort of in the cards in a way that I had not really gamed out because I don't know the internal psychology of Democrats that well.
Well, there's interesting reporting that I read yesterday, and I wish I could remember where I read it to give credit to whoever reported it. But there was a member of Congress, I believe a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, who, in discussing how this unfolded, said that Barack Obama and Jim Clyburn behind the scenes had spoken about the possibility of holding sort of mini conventions for the Democrats across the country, 5 or 6 mini conventions where they would sort of work through this stuff. And you're left to reason from that maybe that's why Barack Obama took as long as he did, or didn't endorse for a while. And I think the fact that there was this pause that other, would-be contenders didn't endorse right away does suggest that at least initially they thought there's a possibility for this to go in a different direction. And I think they could have, she could have declared when Biden endorsed her, she could have, obviously said, I'm honored and I intend to be a candidate. But still, I think Democrats could have had some kind of process to get her to that point. I think I really do think there was that moment, or at least there were enough Democrats who wanted to create that moment where others who might have been interested could have come in. But ultimately, the momentum moved very quickly, and as we've discussed, in Dispatch Live and elsewhere, I do think they made a very, very shrewd decision that when history looks back on this might turn out to have been determinative or decisive, and that was the Harris people leaking her VP list, about 2 hours in, because it in real time, I mean, you really could watch it. It changed the conversation from who is likely to be the Democratic nominee to who is going to be Kamala Harris's running mate. And immediately there was, this discussion of the handful of names that we got. And if those people who were also often mentioned as potential challengers to Kamala Harris heard their names as potential running mates, it seems to have frozen them. Now, we don't know if any of those people were likely to declare or were really interested in taking their shots. But if they were, they didn't. And I do think we're going to look back on that as pretty important.
Yeah. I mean, I think there were also this was something that was really an insider's thing, right? As much as they were responsive to public sentiment, people gaming this out are serious political insider, operative types. And they just start looking at starting an entire presidential campaign from scratch, figuring out the campaign money stuff, all that kind of thing. And then they say, well, we got the Biden campaign. It's there. It's functioning. Half the signs already have her name on it. We can use all of this infrastructure and be turnkey. I think that would just became the path dependence thing. I think was loomed had a very powerful impact inside the rooms where it was happening, right?
Because I think it's short-sighted, honestly. I think operatives care about operative stuff. Probably the person who has oversight over the signs really thought. I mean, I don't know that they're going to reuse the signs; they're going to print new ones.
But you know what I mean, right?
Pick the example. The people whose lives are dedicated to doing this thing in a campaign think the thing that they do in the campaign is absolutely crucial to the winning. Right. I think that I sound like a wannabe Gen Zer, but the potential vibe shift that would have come with a more serious, substantive ticket of a couple of maybe governors or a governor or senator who have more accomplishments in politics, who have run a state or something like that, and are normal in a way that I think Kamala is not. She's a far left progressive Democrat. If you have somebody who's a little bit more moderate, could speak common sense in a way that I don't think comes natural to her. I think that those changes would have dramatically overshadowed the whatever the campaign functionary things.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, it's sort of the guy in charge of putting together the campaign ads already has all of this B-roll ready of Kamala Harris,
right?
And he'd have to shoot new stuff with Gretchen Whitmer or whatever, right? And that person's in the room making arguments in a way that the people who don't know what they don't know aren't in the room. So let me ask you this: it's a twofold question. One, is it fair to say that Harris was a DEI-hire? And two, is it good politics to say it?
Yeah. Okay. So on the former, I think it depends what people mean when they say that, and that's not a cop-out. If the question is she's a DEI-hire, and I think this is the way that people like Representative Glenn Grothman and Tim Burchett and some other Republicans who have made this comment have meant it. If the claim is she's a DEI-hire and therefore was otherwise unqualified to be the Democratic nominee, but for these immutable characteristics, I don't think that's right. I think if you look at her experience and background in politics, it's not the profile I would want. She doesn't have the politics I would want. But is she a plausible, passable candidate for president? Sure she is. She served as vice president for 3+ years. She was a senator. She worked as a prosecutor. She was attorney general of California. I mean, there are all sorts of things that I think you can point to and say, yes, she's passably She's a reasonable candidate. She's a reasonable candidate profile. It's especially rich when those same people are pushing J.D. Vance as a plausible presidential candidate, defending him. I mean, he's got some things that are admirable that I think are great. Like his book is incredible. The way he powered through Ohio State and went to Yale Law School. No,
he was a Marine. Like,
Marine
who doesn't
service.
love a Marine?
Yeah, his service. But he's younger and he has a lot less experience. I mean, she's got 20 more years of experience. So in that sense, I think it's not an accurate claim. On the other hand, as you pointed out, and as others have pointed out, Joe Biden announced in advance what he was going to do, that he was going to make his selection based on demographics. He did it. He talked about it. He defended it. If you go back and you read, I constantly reference this Jonathan Martin, Alex Burns book because I think it's so good. It had so much reporting in particular about the Biden, the sort of transition. The whole point of the book was this transition from the end of Trump into early Biden, but they go into great detail, a ton of reporting on the reasons for selecting Kamala Harris. And this was among them. They wanted a diversity pick. So it's a bit disingenuous now for Democrats to, sort of scream in horror when people point out that, yeah, this was part of the deal. This was part of the reason that he did what he did. So in that sense, I don't think it was the pick made in part to further what Joe Biden thought would be diversity, equity, and inclusion? Yeah, of course it was.
Yeah, so this is just one of these things where I get really annoyed at the heads we win, tails you lose aspect of certain things, right? It's like Biden wants all the credit in the world for in advance saying that diversity and inclusion are extremely important to him. And for that reason, he thinks it's vital that he name a Black woman as his running mate or as his first Supreme Court pick. And he wants all the credit from all of the various people who think DEI is the most important thing in the world. And then when conservatives say, okay, so she's a DEI pick, like, how dare you? How dare you, sir? Yep. Right? And it's like, and I understand, I mean, this sort of gets to the politics, the second part of the question, which is about the politics, but like, I understand that there are people, there are Charlie Kirk types who are using DEI-hire in a racist way. But that doesn't mean simply taking you at your word that it's a DEI-hire and saying it's a DEI-hire means I'm being racist when I do it, right? I mean, and I find it really frustrating. It gives me flashbacks to, and I'm willing to take on, I will stand alone at the Oxford Union against all comers and debate and defend Mitt Romney's use of binders full of women till I can, my legs turn to noodles and I die of starvation.
Man, because can you imagine how huge the crowd would be for that?
Well, no, it's like Romney did exactly what feminists want, right? Which was like reach out to all the stakeholder, feminist groups and women in business groups and ask for names. Like send us names. And like he was proactive about it. He didn't wait to be lobbied to do that. He said, I really want a lot of women in my administration. And he tells the story basically saying exactly what feminists should want him to do and that he did it. And he uses the phrase that they sent over binders full of women. And because it sounds vaguely S&M-like or something, and Romney's such a square, they vilify him for it. And the press just goes nuts getting on the bandwagon with that. And it's similar with this. It's like the cognitive dissonance and the weird white liberal guilt and the insecurity that comes invariably with considering race in your hiring causes people to put up these defense mechanisms really quickly and get this bandwagon effect saying, look, they're all racist for calling this a DEI-hire. And the groupthink, this is one of these things where I think the Dispatch provides a service because it's like the groupthink is just so intense.
Yes.
That said, I've just been cavalierly using the phrase DEI-hire here. I personally do not think Republicans should go around calling her a DEI-hire for precisely the reason I'm getting at, which is that let's just call it affirmative action. Affirmative action makes people feel uncomfortable, including African Americans. Like the idea of everyone's sort of for the original LBJ version of affirmative action. But the second you start talking about racial preferences and all that kind of stuff,
Right.
even black voters are against it. And they say so in polls all the time. And one of the things that makes them against it is precisely because of the inherent implication of tokenism and lack of merit that everybody dislikes. And so it's one of the reasons why we should just stop doing this in the first place, because it's impossible to avoid this kind of social upheaval when you have legalized, racial preferences.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, look, I worked on Proposition 209 as like my one brief foray into electoral campaign politics. Proposition 209 was a ballot initiative in California in 1996 that outlawed racial preferences and quotas in higher education, government contracting, government hiring, and the polling that we did, the public polling and the polling that we did, found that if the language that was in the ballot initiative was actually taken from the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and it polled very well, as you might expect it would. But one of the arguments, the person who ran that campaign, Ward Connerly, one of the arguments that he made pretty consistently was this unfairly stigmatizes successful blacks, women, Hispanics, whomever, because they will constantly face suspicions that they got the positions they did or gained admission in the way that they did for those reasons, and it was unfair. And I think he was right. It's a difficult topic to discuss because for precisely the reason, the way that you framed it. I mean, I do think for some, I mean, we have seen this sort of rebirth of racism on the right. Like, there's just no other way to put it. In my view, when Proposition 209 passed in 1996, my very strong view, and I'd worked sort of in the conservative movement for 5 years at this point, 3 years, was this thing obviously passed because people carefully considered the language and the implications and voted for it on its merits. And while, there might have been a very small fringe of people who were actually racist and voted for it for those motivations, it was a very small fringe. Now, I think when you have people, I mean, you can look at some of the comments that people have made in public over the past several days and say, there are people who are sort of unapologetic about being racist today in a way that shocks me still. And maybe I was naive. I'm willing to cop to naivete. So that, I think, is why you don't want, if you're running Republican campaigns or you're running a campaign against her, or you want Donald Trump to win, you don't want to add to the perception that that's what's driving this. And I think it is a perception, and it will scare, in particular, I think, white suburban women voters who are likely to be among the most necessary voters for whoever's going to win at the presidential level in November. And that's why you've had House Speaker Mike Johnson, apparently in a meeting yesterday, I believe it was Tuesday, give this admonition to his troops, to House Republicans. Hey, don't do the whole DEI-hire thing. It's bad. It's bad politics. I think it probably is bad politics in general, precisely because it offends the people that I think Republicans are most likely to need if they're going to prevail. Certainly, I think in Senate race, competitive Senate and House races, and whatever upside there is, I think the Trump campaign has put a premium on getting white working class men to the polls. And stealing those voters from Democrats. Does calling Kamala Harris a DEI-hire really juice that demographic? Are these people who otherwise would have stayed home, but for the Republicans labeling Kamala Harris a DEI-hire? I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, it could also have the effect of galvanizing black support for Kamala Harris, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we're already seeing this is one of the reasons why, again, getting back to the horse race punditry for a second, if forced to make a bet today, which would be incredibly foolish, and I think you have some experience about the risks and stresses of making bets about future politics stuff.
And it must be said, real upside.
And if forced to make a bet today, I would say that, let me put it this way, I think Harris is slightly favored to win, and it's not. And again, I think things are going to look very different in a week, never mind in 5 weeks. I think if she doesn't solidify if she doesn't define herself adequately very soon, Republicans will define her for her. And if you look at that ad that McCormick is running in Pennsylvania,
yeah,
it is devastating. And it is just brutal. And she's going to need to have answers to that. My view is,
and it's her words. Her words and her positions. Yeah.
And so she should just, as brazenly as politicians have ever done it, just recant all of it and just flip-flop like you wouldn't believe and pick like Josh Shapiro as her running mate and dare the left to say boo about it and say you've got no place else to go. And if you're going to say that you'd be better off with Donald Trump than the first black woman as president, make that argument. Otherwise, screw you and get in line. And anyway, all that said, one of the reasons why I think, if I had to bet, I think she's slightly favored, is that she doesn't have to win over any of Trump's coalition. All she has to do is get the 5 or 10% of the original Biden coalition just to come home, right, and turn out on voting day. And if 10%, if this boosts the black share of the electorate from what it was looking like to be historically low to historically normal, that may be enough for Michigan. That may be enough for Pennsylvania. If you then talk about the people who are I just don't think I'm going to vote at all because Biden's going to lose and he's too old and I can't vote for Trump. If you give those people a reason to vote, or a fraction of them, that's all she needs is just the natural Biden coalition is a majority coalition. And if the problem Biden had was that it had dissipated, if she can just reconstitute it a little, that gets her numbers to where they kind of need to be. Now, will she do that? Can she do that? Who's she going to pick as a running mate? I have no idea. But it feels to me like that's, I would rather be Kamala Harris today than I would be Donald Trump.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I mean, there was an Axios piece out this morning that she's leaning into super progressive economic policies, and it had some reporting talking to people who are advising her, saying she wants to sort of take what Biden has done. I mean, it framed her role as vice president as supporting what they described as Biden's moderate policies, and then listed a number of things, which are extraordinary examples of Biden spending, just insane spending. So we probably have a little different definition of moderate. But, if she's really going to lean into sort of the progressivism there, I think it's going to just be a harder sell. I mean, she is a California progressive. This is the language she speaks. I think, to the extent that we know what she really believes, I suspect that it's probably a lot closer to, the votes that she cast in the Senate and the way that she campaigned as a presidential campaign in a Democratic primary. Having said all that, I agree with you. I mean, the smartest thing she could do, in my view, is sit down with Joe Biden today at the White House and say, I appreciate the 3.5 years. I appreciate you choosing me as your running mate. I appreciate the 3.5 years I've had with you. I appreciate that you endorsed me for this job. I don't want you to be surprised when I run as far as I can away from your legacy. All of the talk of these double haters who are supposed, they're the soccer moms of this election. They're the potentially gettable chunk of the electorate who could determine the outcome. I don't like the phrase double haters because it connotes,
makes them sound irrational.
Yeah, and they're not. It's totally rational to be lumped in with these double haters or double skeptics, I would say. But if I'm her, I would run away from Joe Biden and Donald Trump, precisely because so much of the electorate looked at both of them and said, this is awful. This is a terrible choice. We can do better. And obviously, that's very delicate. It's hard to run away from your boss and the person you've worked alongside for 3.5 years. And she's going to have to reconcile that. But I think the more separation she's able to create, the better off she's going to be come November.
Yeah, I just like, I made this point on this, she should flip like a ninja and flop like a fish on a pier and make no apologies for it. And people are like, oh, so you think politicians shouldn't, say what they believe and all that kind of stuff? And I was like, my view is like, I don't think well of any of these people. But if you're talking about pure tactics, being a little bit more Bill Clinton and just saying, and just going where the majority is, finding that median voter and saying, that's who I'm here for, is just smart politics at this point. Totally. And the fact that it would move her to the right doesn't upset me. The fact that I think she's an empty vessel, that, she should be an empty vessel who will say and do anything to get elected in this context. And particularly if you think Trump is this existential threat to democracy, what's a little flip-flopping to get rid of that, right?
Have your views changed on this question over the past 20, 30 years? Because it used to be the case that, almost nothing bothered me more than flip-flopping politicians. Yeah. The hypocrisy, the people who are willing to do this in order to stay in office or get into office drove me crazy, and they were the worst of the worst. And I still I still believe that. The people I have come to admire most in elective office are the people who are consistent, almost irrespective of how much I agree with them. Like, give me a Bernie Sanders and an AOC because they believe stuff and they're willing to argue passionately on behalf of a bunch of things that I find wrong and sometimes offensive over, somebody like what we're describing, like a politician who can and will just flip-flop on anything for electoral advantage. But I agree with you entirely. In terms of pure tactics, the advice you're giving, is relevant to 95% of our politicians. And it would be smart if she wants to win.
It's an interesting question. And I'm sort of with you in my heart, is like, I like principled politicians, who have convictions and stand by them. At the same time, I always think about, I remember Ramesh making this argument years ago. It was like, all these people who just blanketly condemn flip-flopping, miss the point that as conservatives, we should always welcome flip-floppers when they flop to our positions.
Right.
And just condemning people for agreeing with you is kind of stupid politics. But at the same time, my views on this have changed a little bit, because it maybe even a lot, because as you know, my longstanding gripe about the weakness of parties and all this kind of stuff, right? The incentive structure in our politics, and you and I have talked about this online and off for 8 years now. The incentive structure in politics is unchanged, in the sense that politicians always want to get reelected, right? That's always been true. And one of the things that you and I kind of marveled at in the early part of the Trump era was that instinct was still there, even when it came to sucking up to someone like Trump.
Right.
The difference is that the structural incentive structure now is that the way you guarantee the way you protect your incumbency, the way you guarantee getting reelected, is by how you behave with primaries in mind instead of general elections. Because it's the primary that's the threat to your incumbency. It's no longer the general election. And so we used to hate it as conservatives who grew up on the right, when we would see Republicans pander to the right wing, to the National Review or the Weekly Standard position. And then when they get the nomination, all of a sudden tack to the center, right? That would drive us crazy. It's like, hey, you told us you were this and now you're that. And that would drive us crazy. And I get that. But I think our country needs a lot more of that, right? And there is something to be said for politicians, particularly politicians running for president, caring about the representative voter of the majority at the center of our politics, rather than caring about the Bernie bro or the super MAGA guy.
Yeah.
And that's going to require like some flip-flopping from an ideological to a pragmatic thing. How much did we make fun of Bill Clinton for like polling where to go on vacation and coming out for school uniforms and all of these kinds of things? But the genius of all of that is that he was looking dead with just a cold, dead stare, a sniper's stare at the majority-making voter. And he was like, I want to please those people. We have very few politicians that care about those people because they're called rhinos or cucks or sellouts or, or corporate Democrats or whatever. And those are the kinds of politicians we need more of. Is we need people who care about the general electorate and want to build a majority party. And so I'm a little more forgiving of it.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, I think you're right. But that is fundamentally a structural problem.
It doesn't speak well of them necessarily.
Yeah, but it's fundamentally a structural problem. I mean, the solution, because the answer isn't necessarily then to take people who are better aligned, who really believe stuff, and are maybe more closely aligned with people on the. I mean, I hate these terms are imprecise, but the far right or the far left. The solution seems to be isn't necessarily to have fewer of those kinds of elected officials, because I want people who really believe stuff and can have a big discussion and debate about this. The solution is, as you've argued till you're blue in the face, to have structures that incentivize people to make compromises. So it's less that these people don't believe the things that they believe. It's that they're willing to compromise because such compromises will allow them to govern better because they're taking into account sort of people across the spectrum. But I've come to truly admire people across the political spectrum who really believe stuff and are just willing to take a risk and make the argument because they believe in it. Now, on the right, as it happens, the way that's manifested is over the past several years is people who are willing to buck Trump. So it's much more a sort of character argument than it is an ideological argument. On the left, I think it still is more an ideological argument. They advance these issues that they agree with, and that's what keeps them, or why they end up on the left. Anyway, I think you're right about the tactical question.
It's an interesting thing, though, right? It's like, this is a very Yuval Levin point, but like, if you're not interested in creating a real majority party, right? Like, if you're not interested in getting like 55, 60% of the electorate, the way the Democrats had for most of our lives, and where the Republicans could have had, since the 90s, if they had just sort of done things a little differently, then strong ideological minorities in your party have a lot more power, right? If you're only going to run base elections and you only need you're only aiming for 50.1 of the electorate and all of that, then someone who's 10% of the actual electorate, but 25% of your own party has much more leverage on you, right?
Right.
And so like the pro-Hamas people, right? I mean, they're anti-Israel people, they're anti-Zionism people, they're pro-Palestinian people, but there's a segment of these people who are just simply pro-Hamas.
For sure.
And I think that's right, and they're a sufficient part of the Democratic coalition, or let's just postulate that they are for point of illustration. Like, we know from public opinion stuff that Israel's pretty popular in America. It's, and Hamas, very unpopular. That terrorism terrorists are generally unpopular. This sort of win with the base, just turn out your base strategy sends this signal internally in the Democratic Party that they have to accommodate these people. They have to give them something. They can't just give them the hi hat and throw them overboard, right? But when you see Eric Fetterman, he says, screw that noise. I'm 100% on one side of this argument. Yeah, I'm sorry, John Fetterman. And he's more popular than Biden in Pennsylvania, right? Yeah. And I think that like you need in the imagination to realize there are gettable voters outside of your existing coalition if you try to get them. I think that that's something that Republicans miss. Trump will not understand. He just basically thinks that Republican must mean pro-Trump, and that's it. this is why, and we haven't really talked about JD Vance. This is why I think the hype about Vance is so wrong, because Vance, Mike DeWine won by like 20 something points over Vance on the same ballot, right? Vance is not a coalition broadening candidate. He's a coalition hardening candidate. And so my point is like on the flip-flopping thing is like, it's the right position. So Harris should flip-flop to being pro-Israel. She should flip-flop towards the center and all of this stuff and basically sister soldier those people. And if Rashida Tlaib in that crowd denounce her for it, I think that's worth more votes than it loses. And it's the right thing to do. And but anyway.
Well, can I go back to your Fetterman example for a minute? Because I think that sort of illustrates the point or points that I think I'm not making very well. I mean, he's interesting for about 1,000 reasons. But to me, he's interesting because in part he's bucking the obvious trends in the Democratic Party, particularly on Israel. But he's done it on other issues too.
He did it on Biden too. Remember, he was just like, I'm sticking with Biden no matter what, which I thought was interesting.
He's done it on some policy issues, in addition to political issues, and he's done it. I mean, he's a new senator, so he's not up for re-election for 4 years, and probably thinks that he has the freedom to do this. But the people who sort of go along to get along, I mean, if Fetterman were concerned primarily with pleasing the base of the Democratic Party, he wouldn't have said the things he said on Israel, even though, as you point out, Israel's pretty popular in America. But he's still bucking the base in many ways of the Democratic Party. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons that Joe Biden has lost young voters the way that he's lost young voters. Is his ostensible support for Israel, even though I don't see it the way the critics see it. But I think in the long run, what Fetterman is doing is tremendously appealing to voters who are not part of those core party bases. Right? I think normal people have this. Normal people's policy preferences don't line up with party policy preferences as a general matter. So it's not people don't see it as inconsistent or somehow weak for John Fetterman to be, very strongly pro-union and very strongly, for taxes on the rich, these sort of core Democratic positions over the years, but also to buck the Democratic Party in certain ways on both politics and policy issues, because that's the way most normal people think of this stuff, right? You're not a down the line person, but the bases of the parties punish you for doing that. And that goes to your structural point where, people feel like they need to stay in line on these things. And there's a obviously, and we've talked about this in other contexts before, there's a huge media element to all of this, right? Because media have, on the left and the right, have often sort of turned into party line enforcers. So if you say something, after a shooting, as an example on the right, after a shooting, you often have a conservative Republican who will rethink his or her position on gun restrictions, Second Amendment restrictions. And that usually lasts about 3 days. And then that person gets beat up on Fox, and the party activists come down on him, and he often walks it back, or in some cases he's out of Congress. There isn't sort of room for that kind of nuance where people are able to just say what they think, because the party enforcers in the media and the party activists that will help them avoid these primary fights require that kind of partisan loyalty.
Yeah. I mean, the way I kind of think about it is like, if Trump suffers from this a great deal, right? Is that he constantly thinks when we were growing up, like the base was not the most ideological people. It was the most reliable people. It was the most reliable voters, right? The core voters kind of thing. And yeah, they tended to be more conservative, particularly since the 1960s. But the reason why Republicans courted the base in primaries was not to get the entire base to vote for them. It was to get enough of the base that when you added it to the more centrist voters, you had a winning coalition. And now, because base-only election model says, no, you need the whole base, and you can just win on that. And particularly in very red states, right? And the same works with blue and Democrats. And so the problem is, with that logic, is that everybody only gets one vote. The base-only election strategy says, I want these people to vote with great intensity, as if like that vote counts twice if someone really means it, versus someone who just held their nose and wandered in and cast a ballot and didn't think twice about it. And so you think about like politicians like Lisa Murkowski. I'm not the biggest fan of Lisa Murkowski in the world, but she kind of understands that you can build a big, broad coalition that allows you to say no to your base from time to time. And I want politicians of conviction and good character, and I think the good character thing should be more non-negotiable than it is, which is to say somewhat non-negotiable, because it's completely tolerable now. But like, we could have like I think the thing that you admire in Fetterman, that I admire in Fetterman, is it's really not, the point really isn't that he's right about the Israel stuff. It's that he's willing to say it regardless of the consequences, right?
Yeah.
He's staking out a position. And I think that's attractive to a lot of people who may disagree with him, who may think the Israel thing is a lot more nuanced kind of thing. And I think that getting back to my point, because we keep talking around it, if Harris wants to rebut this idea that Trump is strong and Democrats are weak and that she's weak, she's a woman and all that kind of stuff, coming out of the gate, taking some positions that draw ire from some people on the left, and that she says this is the right thing to do. Maybe it's not Israel for reasons that, are above my pay grade, but like whatever it is, coming out as a sort of Clinton Democrat just strikes me as like really, really obviously smart. And so I give it maybe a 50-50 shot that she'll do it,
I give it less. Less percentage that she'll do it. But I agree with you. I think it's smart.
I'm being hopeful. All right. So I know we're going a little long, but just quickly, how do you think this scrambles the Trump campaign? Do you think that we're already seeing reports that people in Trump world, our friend Tim Alberta had a thing about how there are a bunch of Trump insiders who are like, oof, maybe Vance was a mistake, either because Vance isn't showing that he has the chops they thought he did, or because if they knew they're going to be running against Harris, this isn't the person they would have picked. And I don't know if you've seen the Stephen Miller complete give the baby his bottle breakdown clip about how this is just this is an outrage. Stephen Miller, who was integral to January 6th and the stolen election stuff, is now very upset about the affront to democracy that putting Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket is, because it erases those 14 million votes for Joe Biden. Anyway, how do you think it shakes out? What do you think the response is like?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think it's too early to know how Vance is going to play. And I will be honest. I mean, I'm not a fan of J.D. Vance for a lot of reasons. I don't agree with him. I think, everything that we've just said about my respect for people who take positions and hold them. I mean, I'm fine with politicians who change their views because there's new information or there's new evidence or there's new facts or they've considered a policy for a while and have come to a different conclusion. Fair enough. But, the kinds of changes that we've seen in J.D. Vance that people have talked about both on sort of the character side and on the policy side are absurd. Trump from the American Hitler to, the last best hope for the United States continuation, for the preservation of the American experiment. He's a caricature in that regard, and I think he deserves everything he gets when people point that out. Having said that, I think some of the criticism that we've seen over him in these first few days is overblown. He had there's a moment that made the rounds in social media, and these clips that Oppo researchers and or the mainstream media pick to make candidates look bad, particularly Republicans, where he made a joke about Diet Mountain Dew and that seeming racist. And the joke didn't land the way that you would hope it would have landed. And so everybody's mocking him for it. He was following up on other claims that people said. I believe there was a commenter on MSNBC who said that, J.D. Vance wanting to be buried alongside his family was evidence of sort of white supremacist thinking. It's like,
I defended him on that. That's
totally preposterous. Yeah, it's just so stupid. And so, he was, I think, making the Diet Mountain Dew joke. It's sort of coming from that place, looking to come back. And, it's this kind of moment where in our meme culture and the super online world can come to define people unfairly. Like, I don't think it was a great moment. His joke didn't land, but it was one joke in one speech, in the first week of his being a candidate. I think it's a little silly for people to say, as we're seeing, I think a lot of people on the left say, therefore J.D. Vance is a terrible candidate. Look at this joke didn't land, therefore he's terrible. Will he be able to withstand sort of deeper scrutiny, more substantive scrutiny? I do think that's an open question. I think the advantage to picking J.D. Vance if you're Donald Trump is a play for the upper Midwest. And I do think J.D. Vance sort of speaks that language. I didn't love his speech. I thought it was really disjointed. I thought it looked like it was the work of 5 or 6 different authors. It didn't hang together. The biography that he has that he could have used, I think, to really propel him into a discussion of policy issues just didn't hang together. I thought it was a bad speech. But I didn't think his delivery was bad. It's sort of understated and authentic. And I think he speaks the way a lot of people in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin speak. And in that sense, I think he could add some positives to the Trump campaign. His negatives, I think, are obvious, and the kinds of things that he said. If we go and we look at the ads that have been put together highlighting Kamala Harris's extremism, the same kinds of things on more substantive issues can and have been done about J.D. Vance. And I think he creates vulnerabilities there. I mean, I do think some of the stuff he's said, his comment, sort of flippant comment about married women needing to stay with their abusers. That's a paraphrase. That's not an exact comment, but that was the sort of the thrust of what he was saying. That's a huge liability. And he said other things like that I think will strike women voters in particular as deeply offensive, and will end up being hugely problematic for the Trump campaign. I think he's more of a mixed bag. Maybe he ends up being a liability in the way that people are suggesting. I think it's a little early to come to that conclusion.
Yeah, I agree, and I stipulate he's very smart. It's a very weird thing. It's like, and I was talking to AB about this yesterday, but like, I've never had someone on a ticket for a presidential campaign who, I don't know him well. I've met him once or twice, but with whom I have more friends in common or more acquaintances in common. This is like from NR world to AEI world to like people I know in Teneo and that kind of thing. And plus sort of conservative legal world. It's not even a Kevin Bacon thing. It's like 1 degree of separation across like 5 different places. And they all tell me how smart he is and, how great he is and all that kind of stuff. And that's all fine. He's been a politician. He's been in office for 18 months. He would not have won the primary were it not for Trump's endorsement. He underperformed all sorts of other Republicans in that election. And then you look at the process by which they picked him, and it has nothing to do, as far as I can tell, with actual, like, let's crunch the numbers and see who helps us with the Midwest. The theory that he helps with the Midwest, you're from the Midwest, you're in the Midwest right now. The idea that the people who were inclined to vote for Donald Trump wouldn't, let me put this, the people who weren't inclined, that there are a lot of people who weren't inclined to vote for Donald Trump, but now that J.D. Vance is on the ticket, are going to, I just don't find very persuasive, right? I just don't know who. And there's an argument that you hear from some people that they're actually not trying to go for like the blue collar, car mechanic types and the plumbers, because they're already voting for Trump, they're trying to get at like the very online gamer, pro wrestling. That's what the last night of the convention was about. These extreme low propensity voters. And I just don't know that the egghead guy from Yale Law School is the guy to get that crowd. And
no, but he does say enough stuff that would play. I mean, if that's what they're actually trying to do, that is one of the dumbest theories of this race that I've ever heard. But if that's what they're actually trying to do, I mean, he says the kinds of things that I think would appeal to that crowd. I mean, so
yeah, I agree. He says the kind of things that would appeal to that crowd. Did it appeal to enough of them to turn off the PlayStation and go vote? I don't know, right? And so I just think there's this enormous amount of hype among Vance boosters, and it basically comes from two quarters. Sort of intellectual people that I respect and like, who know him and maybe are a little sort of not corrupted, but you know what I mean? Like swayed by friendship. Friendship can be real corrupting, right. Or give you a bias, right? The friendship bias is real. And by like hardcore MAGA heads who are very, very, very online, or Donald Trump Jr. types, right? And so like the eggheads like him, I think, in part because they think he's one of them. That's not really an electoral strategy.
Right.
And the MAGA heads like him because he's a creation of Donald Trump, which is not an electoral strategy. And I agree with you entirely about the speech. I think the speech was bad, boring. I don't really care about the delivery so much, except that he clearly does not have that connection. I mean, you and I were both in the stadium for Sarah Palin's speech, and Sarah Palin has a fraction of J.D. Vance's IQ. I think it's fair to say, and didn't do nearly as well on the LSATs. But man, did she have a charismatic connection with an audience. And the fact that he didn't pick up when he read the speech, when he practiced the speech, right? That he didn't recognize, like a good politician says, hey guys, this speech isn't for me. Or this speech, I can feel it not clicking. They can recognize it. He's just not an experienced politician. And so I think like the fact that it was a bad speech is a sign that he's not a good politician. Because a good politician would have said, "This isn't the speech for me."
Or an inexperienced politician. I mean,
fair.
I don't know if. Yeah, I think he'll improve. I mean, it was the case. I mean, I was waiting to do NBC analysis after the speech, and was sort of up on the concourse level of the venue in Milwaukee, and people were streaming out at the end. I mean, people were just sort of done with the speech, and they were not following. They were not paying attention. They were leaving. And he had a number of moments during the delivery of that speech beyond his sort of, what appealed to me, which is kind of just a regular normal guy delivery. There were also times when he tried to play to the crowd and it didn't work. And the people on TV had no idea what he was talking about. And he was having this weird back and forth with the crowd. I think he'll get better as it comes from experience. But I think your earlier point is really an important one. He was a bad candidate when he ran for Senate. And if I were, on the Trump team, that's what I would be most concerned about. It was the case that, he was rescued by the Trump endorsement, certainly in the Republican primary. And then, and this gets overlooked too often, in the general election, he was losing. He was not beating Tim Ryan, who was a very good Democratic candidate, sort of an Ohio-made Democratic candidate.
Yeah.
Until the Republican establishment, the Mitch McConnell Republican establishment, swooped in with $36 million in spending to help carry him to victory. Some of those people, I imagine, are having second thoughts on the wisdom of having done that. But I agree with you. That's what would concern me more than, these moments where somebody plucks out a 20-second clip of a speech that he gave last week and tries to make it a thing. Was that was a longer test, and he didn't do particularly well in that longer test.
All right, I know you got to go. I do have one idea that I want to throw by you. Let's say it wouldn't be something the Dispatch would do because we are high-minded stewards of excellent journalism and whatnot. But let's imagine you're Chris Christie or Liz Cheney or Democrat operative or Lincoln Project. I'm not trying to say they're all the same because I like Liz a great deal and I have respect for her, and Chris Christie, is different than the Lincoln Project, and the Lincoln Project is basically a Democratic super PAC. But my point is, if one were inclined to sow mischief and discord in Trump world, I think the smartest play, I was thinking about this morning, if you just really wanted to screw with the ticket in the campaign, you should coordinate talking points in interviews, not necessarily in ads or anything like that, but just asides. Get Mark Leibovich and that crowd to start talking about this and make it a meme that JD Vance is suffering because he's obviously so much smarter than Donald Trump and he can't reveal it because Trump is so insecure, and just constantly plays on that theme. Trump hates the idea that anybody thinks they're smarter than him, and it will drive him crazy, and he will start attacking JD, or he'll start saying on the stump, people say JD is smarter than me. We know that's not true, and that kind of thing. And it'll take on a life. It'll become a self-fulfilling thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of mischief to be made there. I did some reporting on the process that Trump used to pick Vance, and had the chance to talk to a couple people, at least, who were having direct conversations with Trump about sort of how he was weighing his selection. I definitely think, and it's hard to convey to people how much this matters to Trump, because you can see it mattering because he cares so much about PR and about perceptions and about the media. But I do think the way that we got the Vance pick was in part because he was trying to please different people in the media who would say good things about him, because Trump cares so much. So I think the fact that Tucker Carlson was a staunch and consistent advocate for J.D. Vance mattered a lot to Donald Trump. The fact that it would please Donald Trump Jr., whom I don't think Trump has a ton of respect for his son's intellect. There are indications that that's the case. But he thinks his son is very popular with sort of right-wing influencer world.
Right.
And he's not wrong. He's not wrong about that. The Charlie Kirk types, and Charlie Kirk was pro-Vance as well. So I think if you got to the point where it looked like those people were more enthusiastic about J.D. Vance than they were about Donald Trump, Donald Trump would react to that. I think you're absolutely right. How exactly you would do that if you're a mischief maker, I'm not sure. I mean, the Lincoln Project tries to do this. They're basically, as you say, they're a Democratic super PAC now, and it's been interesting to watch. The people who were shilling for Joe Biden and saying he's the greatest president and should be on Mount Rushmore, turned so quickly to shilling for Kamala Harris and saying, it was unthinkable that she would replace him a week ago, and now that she's replaced him, she's the greatest. It's sort of silly. But the Lincoln Project tries to do this, and they're trying to troll on the Vance question. I think it's the kind of thing that could just happen organically without any mischief making, right? I mean,
for sure, if
Vance gets this kind of adulation from that world, and the idea, he was picked, and a lot of people called him Trump 2.0 or MAGA 2.0, and I get that. From my slightly different view is that he's more MAGA plus than he was just sort of an updated version of MAGA, in that he lives and dwells in that sort of new right intellectual world and has the not only approval but enthusiasm of that crowd, the sort of Claremont post-liberal, crowd. That could bother Trump too, because especially because of Trump's thirst for being recognized as an intellectual, which he's not. He wants that so badly. It's why he talks about Wharton. It's why he brags the way that he does. If Vance is getting that kind of adulation and Trump isn't, that will bother Trump, and that could create tensions for sure.
All right, Steve, get back to work on that piece. I know you got to get that thing done. And
the one piece has been overtaken by events. I'll come up with another at some point.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. 18 months and we'll see something. That'll be great. It's particularly fun to be a dick towards you at a great distance.
I've grown so accustomed to it. It doesn't really.
I know. I mean, it's like every now and then people ask me, "Do you guys really dislike each other?" And it's like, "What?"
Really? Do people think that? I don't get that question.
I've been asked that.
It's because you're so much harsher on me than I am on you. I've never been asked that question.
That is just factually false. You are just so much. You're so much more personal and meaner to me than I am to you. It's okay. I can take it. You know,
you should give that to Alex for some fact checking.
Fact checking, that'd be good. All right, so Hayes is finally out of the studio. We can speak freely now. Anyway, I hope this sort of scratched the itch on Punditry Palooza. We are going to do other, barring some craziness. You know, we're recording this on Wednesday morning, and for all I know, Bibi Netanyahu's speech, Joe Biden's address to the nation tomorrow will mean that we have to do another week of what's going on in politics stuff. But we're going to start diversifying the diet on here again forthwith. And other than that, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Shut up, Jonah.